My boyfriend called his rough behavior affection and expected me to accept it, but I finally drew a line and made sure he faced consequences he never saw coming. It started small the way these things always do when you're still convincing yourself it's love. His name was Ryan, 6'2", with a crooked smile that used to make my stomach flip. And for the first 8 months we dated, he was everything I thought I wanted. Attentive in public, generous with compliments. The guy who remembered my coffee order and texted good morning at exactly 7:15 every day. But behind closed doors, the affection had teeth. The first time he grabbed my wrist too hard during an argument about whose turn it was to do dishes, he left faint purple fingerprints that I hid under long sleeves for a week. When I showed him the marks, he laughed, called it playful passion, said I was too sensitive, because real couples roughhouse. I swallowed the unease because the good moments still outweighed the bad. Dinners he cooked when I was exhausted from my nursing shifts. Surprise flowers on random Tuesdays. The way he held me like I was the only thing keeping him grounded after his long days at the construction site. I told myself everyone has flaws. That his intensity came from a rough childhood he rarely talked about. That if I just loved him enough, the edges would soften. Months passed and the roughness escalated in ways so gradual I almost missed the pattern. A playful shove that sent me stumbling into the kitchen counter, hard enough to bruise my hip, but not hard enough to leave visible proof for anyone else to notice. He'd pull my hair during sex when I hadn't asked, then whisper, "You like it rough, don't you?" As if my silence meant consent. When I tried to talk about it, he'd flip the script, eyes wide with hurt, voice cracking as he asked why I was making him feel like a monster, when all he wanted was to show how much he desired me. I started questioning my own reactions. Maybe I was frigid, maybe I was overreacting, maybe this was just how passionate men expressed love, and I was the one failing to match his energy. Friends noticed I flinched sometimes when someone reached for me unexpectedly, but I brushed it off as clumsiness. My best friend Maya pulled me aside at brunch one Sunday and asked point blank if Ryan was hurting me. I laughed too loud, said he was just intense, and changed the subject before she could press. Deep down, I knew the truth was uglier, but admitting it felt like admitting defeat. Like proving every warning my mother ever gave about bad boys. Right. Then came the night that cracked the illusion wide open. We'd gone out to celebrate his promotion, beers at our favorite dive bar, shots he insisted on buying for the whole table, his arm slung possessively around my shoulders the entire time. By the time we got home, he was buzzed and handsy in a way that crossed from affectionate to aggressive. I told him I was tired, that I had an early shift, and tried to slip into the bathroom to change. He followed, blocked the door with his body, grabbed both my wrists and pinned them above my head against the wall while he kissed me hard enough that my lips split against my teeth. When I pulled back, tasting blood, he grinned like it was a victory. "See? That's how much I want you," he said, voice thick with liquor and pride. I stared at him, heart hammering, and for the first time the fear outweighed the confusion. I wrenched free, locked myself in the guest room, and sat on the floor with my back against the door while he banged on it, alternating between apologies and accusations that I was overreacting again. He eventually passed out on the couch. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, he woke with a hangover and a sheepish smile, handed me coffee like nothing had happened, and when I quietly said we needed to talk about last night, he rolled his eyes and muttered, "Jesus, babe, it was just rough sex. You used to like it." That was the moment something inside me shifted, not exploded, not dramatically, just a cold, clear certainty that this wasn't affection, and I wasn't going to keep pretending it was. I didn't yell, didn't cry in front of him. I simply said, "I'm done accepting this as normal," packed a small bag while he showered, and left for Maya's apartment. Before he came out of the bathroom, he texted nonstop for 2 days. Apologies mixed with guilt trips about how I was abandoning him when he needed me most. Promises to change. Photos of the bruises he'd somehow given himself proving he was hurting too. I didn't respond. Maya let me stay on her couch as long as I needed, listened without judgment when I finally told her everything, and helped me find a women's shelter counselor who specialized in coercive control. The counselor didn't rush me into labeling it abuse. She asked gentle questions that let me hear my own words out loud for the first time. The wrist grabs, the hair pulling, the shoves disguised as play. The way he always framed my discomfort as my failure to appreciate his passion. By the end of the first session, I was shaking, but not from fear, from recognition. This wasn't love with rough edges. This was control wearing affection's mask, and I had let it carve pieces out of me for too long. I started documenting everything. Old photos of bruises I'd once deleted, screenshots of texts where he dismissed my concerns, a timeline of incidents going back 18 months. I changed my phone number, blocked him on every platform, and filed for a temporary restraining order after he showed up at my hospital during my shift, standing in the parking lot holding roses like some romantic gesture instead of the violation it was. Security escorted him off the property. He looked stunned, like he genuinely hadn't expected consequences. That look, the wide-eyed disbelief that I would actually enforce a boundary, stayed with me. It fueled the next steps. I moved into a new apartment with better locks and a buzzer system, told my supervisor about the situation so the front desk knew not to let him through, and began the slow work of rebuilding the parts of myself he'd tried to break. Friends rallied around me in ways I hadn't anticipated. Maya organized a moving crew. My coworker Jenna brought casseroles for weeks. Even my usually stoic brother drove 6 hours just to install motion sensor lights outside my new place. Their support was quiet but fierce, a reminder that real affection doesn't leave marks. Ryan, meanwhile, didn't disappear quietly. He posted vague, self-pitying stories on social media about being blindsided by betrayal, tagged mutual friends in late-night rants, even sent flowers to my new address with a card that read, "We can fix this if you stop being dramatic." Each delivery went straight into the trash. I didn't engage, didn't explain, didn't give him the reaction he craved. Instead, I focused on the small, steady acts of reclaiming my life: therapy twice a week, self-defense classes on Saturday mornings, nights spent reading books I'd abandoned years ago because he called them boring. Slowly, the flinches stopped. The nightmares faded. and the woman staring back at me in the mirror started looking like someone I recognized again. But I knew the story wasn't over. Ryan wasn't the type to accept rejection without a final push, and I was ready for whatever came next. I had drawn my line in the sand, and this time I wasn't stepping back. The days after I left Ryan felt like walking on glass, every step careful, every sound making me flinch, waiting for the shatter that never quite came. I stayed at Maya's for 2 weeks, sleeping on her pull-out couch with my phone on silent and notifications off, because even his name popping up on the screen set my pulse racing. He didn't stop trying at first. The texts came in waves, sweet apologies at dawn when he was probably still drunk from the night before, angry accusations by afternoon that I was punishing him for one bad night, late night voice messages where his voice cracked with what sounded like genuine hurt, begging me to come home so we could talk like adults. I listened to exactly one before deleting the rest. In it, he said he loved me too much to let me throw everything away over a misunderstanding, that I was breaking his heart the way his mom broke his dad's when she left. The guilt twisted in my gut for a second. Old habits die hard, but then I remembered the taste of blood on my lip, and the way his grin had looked triumphant instead of sorry. I blocked the number. Work became my anchor. 12-hour shifts at the hospital left little room for spiraling. I threw myself into patient charts, IV changes, comforting families in the ER waiting room, anything to keep my hands and mind busy. Colleagues noticed I was quieter, more jumpy when someone approached from behind, but they gave me space. Nurses are good at reading unspoken pain. Jenna, my shift partner of 3 years, started bringing me extra coffee without asking why. And once, when I dropped a tray of instruments because a doctor startled me by touching my shoulder, she covered for me without a word. That kind of quiet solidarity kept me upright. The restraining order hearing came faster than I expected. I sat in the courthouse hallway in my best scrub top and jeans, knees bouncing, clutching the folder of evidence I'd compiled. Dated photos of bruises on my wrist and hip taken in Maya's bathroom mirror, screenshots of texts where he dismissed my complaints as drama, a printed log of every incident I could remember, with times and details. My lawyer, a soft spoken woman from the Women's Center named Carla, reviewed it with me one last time and said, "This isn't about proving he's a monster. It's about proving you have a reasonable fear for your safety." When my name was called, I walked into the small courtroom on legs that felt borrowed. Ryan was already there, sitting straight backed in a button down I'd bought him for Christmas, hair combed, looking every bit the respectable boyfriend who'd been blindsided. He didn't look at me at first. When he finally did, his eyes were red rimmed, pleading. The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes, asked me to state my case. My voice shook at the beginning, but steadied as I spoke. Calmly, factually, about the wrist grabs that left marks, the shoves that left bruises, the night he pinned me against the wall and split my lip, the way he always reframed my fear as oversensitivity. I showed the photos when asked, described the pattern without embellishment. Ryan's lawyer tried to paint it as mutual roughhousing, said I'd never called the police, that I was only seeking attention after a breakup. Carla countered with the timeline, the escalation, the text where he admitted to getting carried away but never to wrongdoing. The judge granted the temporary order on the spot. 2 years, no contact, stay away distance of 500 feet. Ryan's face went blank, then flushed red. He stared at me like I'd slapped him. As we left the courtroom, he tried to approach, mouth open like he was going to say something, but a bailiff stepped between us, and he stopped cold. Outside, Carla squeezed my arm and said, "You did good in there. Breathe." I didn't cry until I got back to Maya's. The sobs came hard and ugly, the kind that leave you hollowed out. Maya held me on the couch until they passed, then made tea and sat with me in silence. That night, I slept without nightmares for the first time in months. Moving into my new apartment felt like crossing a border into new territory. One bedroom, third floor, buzzer entry, deadbolt plus chain. I bought new sheets, new towels, new everything I could afford, so there were no lingering traces of him. I hung fairy lights in the living room because I'd always wanted them, but he said they were childish. I cooked meals just for myself, spicy dal I remembered from my mother's kitchen, garlic bread dripping with butter, without anyone commenting that it was too much effort for one person. I started journaling again, not the pretty bullet point kind, but raw pages of anger and grief, and tiny victories. Today I didn't check his social media. Today I laughed at a patient's joke without looking over my shoulder. Today I wore the necklace he hated because it was too flashy and felt nothing but free. Therapy continued twice a week. Dr. Patel, my new counselor, specialized in trauma bonding and coercive control. She helped me untangle the guilt I'd carried for so long. The belief that if I'd just been more patient, more understanding, he wouldn't have needed to get rough. She gave me language for what I'd experienced. Love bombing followed by devaluation, gaslighting, intermittent reinforcement. And each term felt like a key turning in a lock I'd thought was rusted shut. I learned that his affection had been a weapon, that expecting me to accept pain as proof of love was textbook manipulation. That my leaving wasn't abandonment, it was self-preservation. Friends kept showing up in small, steady ways. Maya helped me build IKEA shelves one weekend. Jenna came over with wine and takeout when I had a rare day off. My brother installed a Ring camera and taught me how to use the panic button. Even my supervisor at work pulled me aside one shift and said, "If you ever need to leave early because something feels off, just say the word. We've got you." Their care was the opposite of Ryan's. Gentle, consistent, no strings. He didn't vanish entirely, of course. Mutual friends started reaching out with concerned messages. "Ryan's really struggling, he misses you so much," or "He says you two just need to talk it out." I responded politely once. "Please don't pass messages. The order is in place for a reason," then blocked them too. A few weeks after the hearing, I spotted his truck parked across the street from the hospital. When I got off shift at midnight, he wasn't in it, but the sight made my stomach drop. I called non-emergency, gave the plate number, stayed in my car with doors locked until a patrol car arrived and confirmed he wasn't on the premises. The next day, Carla filed for an extension of the protection order citing the violation. The judge granted it without a hearing. Ryan's attempts grew quieter after that, Fewer texts from new numbers, no more flowers. But the silence felt heavier, like he was regrouping. I didn't let my guard down, but I also didn't let fear dictate my days. I started running in the mornings before sunrise, joined a book club at the local library, signed up for a pottery class because I'd always wanted to try it, and no one was there to call it a waste of time. Little by little, the apartment became a home, the city streets felt safe again, and the woman in the mirror stopped looking haunted. I wasn't naive enough to think it was over. He still had anger to burn, and men like him rarely accept consequences without one last push. But I was no longer the person who'd accept rough behavior as affection. I'd drawn my line and forced it, and watched him finally face a wall he couldn't charm or force his way through. Whatever came next, I would meet it standing taller than he ever expected. 3 months after the restraining order became permanent, the quiet felt almost unnatural. Like the calm before a storm I knew was still brewing somewhere out of sight. Ryan had gone radio silent on direct contact. No more flowers, no new burner numbers lighting up my phone at 2 a.m. No shadowy truck idling near my apartment complex. I told myself it was progress, that the legal wall I'd built had finally forced him to back off. But every time I walked to my car after a night shift, I still scanned the parking lot twice, keys threaded between my fingers like makeshift claws. The self defense instructor at the community center had drilled that habit into us. Awareness first, always. I kept going to class twice a week, learning how to break wrist holds, how to strike soft targets if someone grabbed me from behind, how to use my voice as a weapon before anything physical escalated. The instructor, a former cop named Maria with kind eyes and calloused hands, pulled me aside after one session and said, "You're doing the work. Most people stop after the first bruise heals. Keep going." Her words stuck with me. They reminded me that healing wasn't a finish line, but a direction. One deliberate step at a time. Therapy with Dr. Patel deepened too. We started unpacking the smaller, sneakier ways Ryan had eroded my sense of self long before the physical stuff got obvious. The constant joking comments about my weight when I skipped the gym. The way he'd sigh dramatically if I wanted to hang out with friends instead of staying home with him. The subtle digs at my job that made me feel like nursing was cute, but not serious. I cried during one session when I realized how much I'd internalized his voice. Even now, when I caught myself eating dessert or saying no to overtime, a faint echo whispered that I was being selfish or lazy. Doctor Patel asked me to write letters I would never send. One to the version of me who stayed so long. One to Ryan explaining exactly what he'd done. One to the woman I was becoming. I wrote them in a spiral notebook I kept hidden under my mattress, pages filled with ink that smudged from tears. The one to myself was the hardest. You deserved gentleness. You deserved safety. You are not broken for wanting both. Reading it back felt like permission to stop apologizing for existing. Life started filling in the spaces he'd left empty. I reconnected with people I drifted from during the relationship, old college friends who invited me to trivia nights, cousins who lived across town and suddenly wanted weekly video calls. Maya and I made it a ritual to meet for coffee every Sunday. We'd sit outside the same cafe near the river, talking about everything except him, until one day she looked at me and said, "You laugh different now. Freer." I hadn't noticed, but she was right. The sound came easier, lasted longer, didn't trail off into worry that I'd said the wrong thing. At work, I volunteered for the mentorship program, guiding new nurses through their first chaotic shifts. Helping them navigate the emotional weight of the job reminded me how capable I was, how I'd always been the steady hand in a crisis. One evening, a young nurse named Aisha broke down in the break room after losing her first patient. I sat with her, handed her tissues, told her it was okay to feel everything at once. When she hugged me goodbye, she whispered, "Thank you for not making me feel weak." Those moments stitched me back together thread by thread. Then, the first crack in the quiet appeared. It started small. An anonymous review posted on my hospital's online feedback page. Nurse, 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 rude and unprofessional. Avoid if you want decent care. The hospital investigated, found no basis, removed it, but the seed of doubt lingered. A week later, a similar one-star Google review appeared on the cafe where Maya and I met. Staff is hostile, especially the tall brunette who sits there every Sunday judging customers. I recognized the phrasing, Ryan's favorite way of twisting things so the target looked unreasonable. I screenshot everything, forwarded it to Carla, who added it to the file for potential violation of the no contact order through third-party harassment. She advised me to keep documenting, but not to engage. "He wants a reaction," she said. "Starve him of it." I tried. I kept my routine tight, same routes to work, varied my parking spot, installed blackout curtains so no one could see inside my apartment from the street. But the harassment escalated in ways that felt designed to unnerve rather than confront. My social media stayed private and locked down, yet somehow old photos I'd posted years ago started circulating in local true crime Facebook groups, with captions like, "Does anyone know this woman? She ruined a good man's life." Mutual friends, people I thought were neutral, began unfollowing me or sending passive aggressive messages. "Hope you're happy now that you've destroyed him." I didn't respond, but the isolation crept in anyway. The old fear that maybe I was the problem after all. Dr. Patel helped me counter it. This is classic Darvo. Deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender. He's rewriting the narrative because the truth threatens him. Knowing the tactic didn't erase the sting, but it gave me armor. One night after a particularly brutal 12-hour shift, I came home to find my door ajar. Just a crack. The chain still hooked inside, but the deadbolt unlocked. My heart slammed against my ribs. I backed away, called 911 from the stairwell, waited in the lobby until police arrived. They swept the apartment. Nothing taken, nothing obviously disturbed. But my bedroom window was open 2 inches when I'd sworn I'd closed it that morning. No forced entry, no fingerprints they could lift. Just enough to make me question my own memory. The responding officer took my statement, noted the restraining order, promised to increase patrols. I slept at Maya's again that night, curled on her couch with the lights on. The next day I changed the locks. Again. Added a door jammer, a window sensor that shrieked if disturbed. Carla filed another motion citing the possible break-in as evidence of escalating behavior. The judge granted a hearing. Ryan appeared via video link this time, looking thinner, eyes hollow. His lawyer argued it was all circumstantial, that I was paranoid and seeking more control. I testified again, voice steady this time, listing every incident since the original order. The reviews, the Facebook posts, the unlocked door. When the judge asked Ryan if he had anything to say, he stared straight into the camera and said, "I just want to move on." She's the one who can't let go. The judge extended the order another year and added electronic monitoring. No social media posts that could indirectly reference me. No third-party contact. Ryan's face twisted for a split second. Anger, disbelief, before the screen went black. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt something shift inside me again. Not relief exactly, but resolve. He could keep pushing, keep testing boundaries, but each time he did, I got stronger, the wall higher. Friends rallied harder after the hearing. Jenna started walking me to my car after late shifts. Maya crashed on my couch one weekend just to keep me company. My brother flew in for a long weekend and helped install a full security system. Their presence was loud in the best way. Proof that I wasn't alone. That real love doesn't demand you accept pain to prove it. I started sleeping better, running farther, laughing louder. The woman who'd once flinched at sudden touches now reached for hugs without hesitation. Ryan's consequences were mounting. Legal fees, public embarrassment, the slow realization that his charm no longer opened doors. He never saw it coming because he'd never imagined I'd stop forgiving, stop excusing, stop shrinking. But I had. And I wasn't finished drawing lines. 6 months into the extended restraining order, the harassment had shifted from clumsy and obvious to something colder, more calculated. Like Ryan had finally realized yelling and showing up wouldn't work anymore, so he turned to shadows instead. The anonymous online attacks slowed after the judge's warning about third-party contact, but they didn't stop. They just got smarter. Fake accounts with no profile pictures started leaving one-star reviews on my nursing license board page, claiming I'd been aggressive with patients, unprofessional in scrubs, things vague enough to avoid immediate takedown but pointed enough to sting. The board dismissed them after a quick internal check. My supervisors vouched for me. Patient satisfaction scores stayed high, but the notifications still landed like small punches every time I opened my email. I stopped checking those alerts daily. Dr. Patel suggested setting a weekly review instead, turning it into a controlled task rather than an ambush. "You're not hiding," she said. "You're choosing when to engage." That small shift helped. Control returned in tiny increments. I leaned harder into routine to keep the anxiety from spreading. Mornings began with a 5-mile run along the river path. Now that daylight stretched longer, earbuds in but volume low enough to hear footsteps behind me. The self-defense classes had evolved into something closer to confidence building. Maria taught us situational awareness drills, role-play scenarios where classmates played the aggressor. And I practiced saying "back off" in a voice that carried without cracking. One session I disarmed a mock grab so cleanly, the guy playing Ryan stumbled backward. The class clapped, and for a moment I felt powerful instead of prey. Work remained my safest space. I requested, and got, permanent day shifts so I wasn't walking alone in the dark anymore. Aisha, the new nurse I'd comforted months earlier, became my regular partner. We developed a shorthand during codes, covered each other's breaks, traded playlists for long charting sessions. She never asked about the faded scar on my wrist or why I always positioned myself with my back to the wall in the break room. She just accepted it as part of who I was now. One afternoon, she brought in homemade samosas her mom had sent and said, "For the tough days." I ate 3 standing at the counter, grease on my fingers, and felt something warm settle in my chest. Not the frantic heat of Ryan's affection, but the slow burn of real care. Social life expanded cautiously. Maya dragged me to a pottery class on Wednesday nights. I was terrible at first, clay slipping off the wheel, hands trembling from old muscle memory of being grabbed too hard. But the instructor was patient, and by the 4th week I managed a lopsided mug that held coffee without leaking. I kept it on my kitchen counter like a trophy. Jenna organized game nights at her place, Cards Against Humanity, ridiculous charades, too much wine. And for the first time in years, I stayed until the end without checking my phone for escape texts from Ryan. People laughed at my jokes, asked about my day, remembered details I'd shared weeks earlier. No one demanded I prove my worth through pain or compliance. That absence of expectation felt revolutionary. Then the next escalation came. Quieter, but sharper. My landlord called one Tuesday to say someone had complained about noise and disturbances from my unit. Late night banging, shouting, things that had never happened. He sounded apologetic but firm. Another complaint could mean lease issues. I knew immediately who the complainant was. Ryan had found a way to weaponize bureaucracy without violating the order directly. I documented the call, forwarded the details to Carla, who subpoenaed the complaint form. Sure enough, the signature was a scribbled version of Ryan's initials, address listed as his old apartment across town. Carla filed for contempt of court. The hearing was set for 6 weeks later. In the meantime, I installed noise monitoring apps on my phone, kept a log of every quiet evening, even recorded ambient sound on nights I was home alone. Paranoia crept in again. Every knock at the door made me freeze. Every unknown number triggered a spike of adrenaline. But I refused to let it paralyze me. I started carrying pepper spray on my keychain, legally purchased and practiced with, in an empty parking lot. Maria walked me through deployment drills until the motion felt automatic. The contempt hearing arrived on a gray October morning. I wore the same outfit as the first time, simple black top jeans, hair pulled back, because it had become a kind of armor. Ryan appeared in person this time, suit pressed, hair shorter, expression schooled into something almost contrite. His lawyer argued technicalities. The complaint was filed before the electronic monitoring clause took full effect. No direct reference to me. Free speech protections. Carla presented the timeline, the pattern of behavior, the landlord's statement confirming the signature matched Ryan's on prior lease documents. When it was my turn to speak, I stood at the podium, looked straight at the judge, and said, "He promised to move on." Instead, he found new ways to intrude. This isn't coincidence. This is persistence. The judge didn't interrupt. When Ryan took the stand, he kept his eyes on the floor, voice low. I was upset. I thought if she saw how much I was hurting, she'd talk to me. I didn't mean to cause problems. The judge leaned forward. You were ordered to have no contact. Indirect harassment through third parties is still contact. She found him in contempt. 7 days in county jail, mandatory anger management classes, extension of the protection order to 5 years with GPS monitoring if he violated again. Ryan's head snapped up. His mouth opened, closed. For the first time, he looked small. As deputies led him out, he glanced back at me, not with anger, not with pleading, but with something close to confusion, like he genuinely hadn't believed I'd follow through to this point. Outside the courthouse, the air felt sharper, cleaner. Carla shook my hand. He's learning the hard way that consequences stick. I didn't celebrate. Not yet. I drove home, parked in my usual spot, walked up 3 flights without once looking over my shoulder. Inside my apartment, I lit the candle I'd bought after the first hearing, lavender, because it no longer reminded me of fear, and sat on the couch with my journal. I wrote, today he faced real limits. Today I didn't flinch. That night I slept 8 hours straight, dreamless. The weeks after were quieter still. Ryan served his time. I heard through a distant mutual acquaintance that he lost his job site supervisor position because of the jail record. Friends stopped passing messages. The fake reviews dried up. I kept my routines, runs, classes, pottery, game nights, but they no longer felt like defenses. They felt like choices. I started dating again, slowly, carefully. Coffee with a paramedic named Sam, who laughed easily and never once raised his voice. Walks in the park with a teacher named Priya, who asked questions and actually listened to the answers. Nothing serious yet, but the possibility no longer terrified me. I could imagine hands that didn't grip too hard, kisses that didn't leave marks, affection that didn't demand proof through pain. Ryan had expected me to fold, to accept his roughness as love, to come back when the silence got too loud. He never saw the version of me who would document, testify, enforce, rebuild. He never imagined I'd turn his consequences into my foundation, but I did. And every day since, I've stood taller on it. The year mark after Ryan's contempt conviction arrived quietly, almost anticlimactically, like the final page of a book you've already stopped reading for plot twists. The 5 year protection order hummed in the background. Electronic monitoring logs that Carla received quarterly reports on. Automatic alerts if he came within 500 feet of my listed addresses. A digital leash he couldn't charm his way out of. He'd completed the mandatory anger management classes. The court file noted satisfactory participation in dry bureaucratic language. I didn't feel triumphant when I read the update. I felt detached, the way you feel about an old scar that no longer pulls when you stretch. Life had moved forward in steady, unremarkable increments that added up to something solid. My apartment no longer felt like a fortress. The fairy lights stayed up year round. The pottery mug I'd made held daily coffee without apology, and the bookshelf overflowed with novels I'd once hidden because Ryan called them fluffy nonsense. I read them openly now, curled on the couch with a blanket, and no one to judge the happy endings. Running had become ritual. 6 miles most mornings along the same river path. Sunrise painting the water gold. My breath steady and mine alone. Maria promoted me to assistant instructor at the self-defense center. I taught beginners how to spot red flags before they turned physical, how to trust their gut when someone dismissed their discomfort as overreaction. The women in my classes arrived with the same haunted eyes I once saw in the mirror. I gave them the same gentle permission Dr. Patel had given me. Your fear is valid. Your boundaries are non-negotiable. Watching them practice escapes, hearing their voices grow firmer on the word no, felt like handing back pieces of power I'd once lost. Work deepened into purpose. I became the go-to mentor for new grads facing their first traumatic codes. I sat with them in quiet corners afterward, let them cry or rage or stare blankly while the adrenaline drained. Aisha and I tag teamed shifts so neither of us burned out. We started a small support group for night shift nurses, coffee and debriefs at 7 a.m. in the hospital cafeteria. No hierarchy, just space to say the hard things. One morning, a nurse named Lila confessed she was scared to go home to her boyfriend because he gets intense when he drinks. The room went still, then every head nodded in recognition. I shared my story that day, not the polished version, but the raw one. The wrist marks, the split lip, the way I'd convinced myself his roughness was passion until it wasn't. No one interrupted. When I finished, Lila reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Thank you for saying it out loud. Those words echoed for weeks. Dating stayed slow and intentional. Sam, the paramedic, and I had progressed to occasional dinners. Nothing labeled, just good conversation over pasta, and walks that ended with him asking if I wanted him to walk me to my door. He never pushed, never raised his voice, even in playful argument. Never once made me feel small for setting a boundary. Priya, the teacher, became a close friend first. Our dates were museum visits and bookstore crawls where we argued about plot twists and shared poetry. Both relationships felt light, optional, free of the suffocating intensity Ryan had called love. I could say no to a second date without fear of explosion. I could enjoy a kiss without bracing for it to turn rough. That freedom was intoxicating. Then the silence broke in a way I hadn't anticipated. A letter arrived, actual paper, postmarked from a town 2 hours north. Ryan's handwriting on the envelope. My stomach dropped when I recognized it, but I opened it anyway, standing in the kitchen, with the deadbolt locked behind me. The note was short, typed on plain white paper. I've been in a program up here. Real therapy, not the court-mandated kind. I'm learning why I did what I did. Anger from my dad, fear of being left, thinking control kept people close. I hurt you. I know words don't fix that. I'm not asking for forgiveness or contact. I just needed to say I'm sorry. Properly. I hope you're safe and happy. R. No pleas, no guilt trips, no veiled threats. Just accountability on paper. I read it 3 times, waiting for the old rage or fear to surge. Instead, I felt a strange, quiet neutrality. He'd finally named what he'd done without reframing it as my sensitivity. That didn't erase the bruises, or the nights I'd slept with a chair under the doorknob, but it closed a chapter I hadn't realized was still open. I didn't reply. I didn't burn the letter. I folded it, placed it in the back of the same drawer where I kept the old protection order copies, and shut the drawer. It belonged in the past, not the present. Carla got a copy the next day. She noted it for the file, but agreed it didn't violate the order. If he keeps this distance, she said, let it be. I did. The following spring, I took a solo trip. First one since leaving Ryan, a cabin in the mountains. 3 days of hiking, reading by a wood stove, no cell service. I walked trails alone, shouted into empty valleys just to hear my voice echo back unchanged. On the last night, I sat on the porch watching stars multiply overhead and realized I wasn't scanning for shadows anymore. The fear that had once lived under my skin had shrunk to a manageable size, present enough to keep me aware, quiet enough not to rule me. Back home, I started a small garden on my balcony. Herbs, tomatoes, a stubborn lavender plant that refused to die despite my inconsistent watering. Each sprout felt like defiance, growth without permission, beauty without pain. Friends threw me a quiet 1 year out of the relationship party. Nothing flashy, just Maya's backyard, string lights, too much food, laughter that lasted until midnight. They toasted to lines drawn and held, and I raised my glass without hesitation. Ryan faded further into background noise. Mutual acquaintances stopped mentioning him. The online smears had long since been buried under newer posts. I heard through a distant connection that he'd moved permanently north, taken a warehouse job, stayed single. I didn't check to confirm. I didn't need to. My life had filled with people and routines that didn't require surveillance or apologies. Sam and I were exclusive now, slow, steady, built on mutual respect instead of intensity. Priya remained my confidant, the one I called at 3 a.m. when old memories surfaced. Therapy tapered to once a month. Dr. Patel smiled during our last session and said, you've internalized the tools. You know when to use them. I did. The consequences Ryan never saw coming weren't dramatic revenge or public humiliation. They were quieter, more enduring. A woman who no longer accepted pain as proof of love, who enforced boundaries without apology, who built a life so full there was no room left for his shadow. He'd expected tears, begging, eventual return. Instead, he got distance, documentation, court dates, and silence. I got mornings without fear, nights without checking locks twice. Love that didn't leave marks. And every day I chose that life again. Not out of spite, but because it was mine, hard won, and entirely worth protecting. 2 years after the contempt hearing, the 5 year protection order had become background noise. Annual check ins with Carla that lasted 15 minutes. Routine reports showing Ryan's GPS dot pinned to a small coastal town 3 hours north. No violations logged, no new complaints filed. The silence from his side had stretched so long it felt permanent, like a door that had finally latched shut and rusted over. I no longer jumped at unknown numbers or scanned every face in a crowd for his crooked smile. The hypervigilance had softened into healthy caution, the kind that lets you live instead of merely survive. My apartment had evolved too. No more blackout curtains drawn tight against imagined eyes. Sunlight poured through sheer panels all day. Plants thrived on every windowsill, and the balcony garden had become a small jungle of basil, mint, cherry tomatoes, and that stubborn lavender that now bloomed purple twice a year. I watered it every morning with the same quiet ritual I used to run, barefoot on cool tile, coffee in one hand, watering can in the other, watching leaves unfurl without anyone to criticize the mess. Pottery class had turned into a twice weekly habit. My shelves now held bowls, vases, a set of mismatched mugs glazed in soft blues and greens. One piece, a wide, shallow dish I'd thrown after a particularly hard therapy session, sat on my coffee table, holding keys, loose change, and the occasional pressed flour from walks along the river. It was imperfect, lopsided in places, but it held things without complaint. And that felt like a metaphor I didn't need to explain out loud. Work had shifted from survival mode to something closer to calling. I'd been promoted to charge nurse on days, overseeing a team of 8 during the busiest shifts. The responsibility grounded me, gave me purpose beyond personal recovery. Aisha had moved into a supervisory role too. We ran morning huddles together, debriefed tough cases over cafeteria sandwiches, laughed about the absurdities of hospital bureaucracy, until the tension bled away. The support group we'd started grew into a formal hospital program, weekly circles for staff dealing with burnout, trauma, or personal crises. I facilitated one session a month, sharing just enough of my story to normalize the shame so many carried. I stayed longer than I should have because I thought love meant enduring pain. Leaving didn't make me weak, it made me honest. New nurses listened wide eyed, veterans nodded knowingly. After one meeting, a woman named Sophia pulled me aside and said, I'm in the middle of it right now. My husband says the yelling is just his way of caring. I gave her Carla's card, Dr. Patel's referral list, and my direct number with one instruction. Call anytime the doubt gets loud. You don't have to decide everything today. She texted 2 weeks later. I left last night. Staying with my sister. Thank you. Those messages arrived every few months. Small proofs that the work rippled outward. Dating had deepened without drama. Sam and I had crossed into something steady and real. We spent weekends hiking local trails, cooking elaborate breakfasts in his tiny kitchen, watching documentaries on his couch with my feet in his lap. He knew my history, not every detail, but enough to understand why I sometimes needed space after a long shift, or why sudden loud noises still made me tense. He never pushed for explanations. He just adjusted, lowered his voice during arguments, asked before touching my wrists, respected. Not tonight without sulking. Affection with him felt like breathing, natural, expansive, never suffocating. Priya remained my anchor friend. We traveled together once a year. Short trips to nearby beaches or mountain cabins where we read, swam, talked until dawn. On one such getaway, she asked if I ever thought about Ryan anymore. I stared at the ocean for a long minute before answering. Sometimes. Not with anger or fear, just curiosity about who he became after the consequences stuck. But mostly I think about how much space I've reclaimed. She nodded, passed me the sunscreen, and changed the subject to the ridiculous seagull stealing our chips. No need to dwell. The past had lost its grip. Then, unexpectedly, a small tremor. My brother forwarded an article from a regional news site up north. Local man completes domestic violence diversion program. Speaks at community event. The photo showed Ryan, thinner, hair longer, standing at a podium in a community center, reading from note cards. The caption read, Ryan M., 34, shares his journey from anger to accountability after court mandated intervention. The article quoted him briefly. I used to think control was love. I hurt someone I claimed to care about because I was afraid of losing her. Therapy showed me that real love doesn't demand submission. I'm working every day to be better, not for forgiveness, but because it's right. No mention of me by name, no victim blaming, no self pity parade. Just plain acknowledgement. I read it twice, waiting for the familiar churn of rage or vindication. Neither came. Instead, I felt a faint, almost clinical curiosity. He'd finally heard the words I'd said in court, in therapy notes he'd never seen, in the silence after he left the jail. Whether the change was genuine or performative didn't matter much. What mattered was that the system had held him accountable long enough for reflection to take root. I didn't save the article. I didn't search for more. I closed the tab and went back to chopping vegetables for dinner. That night, Sam came over. I told him about the piece while we ate on the balcony, city lights flickering below. He listened without interrupting, then said, Sounds like he's carrying what he should carry. You don't have to. I nodded. I don't. And I won't. The next morning, I ran my usual route, longer this time, 8 miles because the air felt crisp and my legs wanted more. When I got home, I showered, brewed fresh coffee, and sat on the balcony with my journal. I didn't write about Ryan. I wrote about the garden, how the lavender had finally spread enough to brush against the railing, how the tomatoes were ripening faster than I could eat them, how the mint had taken over one pot and refused to be contained. Growth without permission, without apology. Later that week, I hosted dame night at my place for the first time. Sam, Priya, Aisha, Maya, a few others from work and class. The apartment filled with laughter, clinking glasses, the smell of takeout and fresh baked cookies. Someone put on music. We danced badly in the living room until the neighbors texted, Keep it going. No one grabbed too hard. No one demanded I prove anything through endurance. When the last guest left, I stood in the quiet. Dishes in the sink. Fairy lights glowing soft. I felt it then. Not a dramatic revelation, but a simple truth. The consequences Ryan never anticipated weren't prison bars or ruined reputation alone. They were me, whole, unafraid, surrounded by people who loved without conditions, building days that belonged entirely to me. He'd expected tears in return. He got distance, accountability, and a woman who no longer needed his version of affection to feel loved. And in that quiet victory, I finally let the last echo of his voice fade. The life I'd drawn lines to protect was no longer under siege. It was thriving. And so was I. 3 years had passed since the contempt hearing that finally forced Ryan to face real limits, and the 5-year protection order had become little more than paperwork filed in a drawer I rarely opened. The annual compliance reports from Carla arrived like clockwork. Ryan's GPS still anchored to that same coastal town. Employment stable at a warehouse logistics job. No new incidents. No attempts to relocate closer to my city. The electronic monitoring had become a quiet guardian angel I no longer thought about daily. It simply existed, doing its job without fanfare. My own life had expanded in ways that felt almost ordinary now. The kind of ordinary that once seemed impossible, when every day carried the weight of watching for shadows. The balcony garden had outgrown its pots. I'd upgraded to raised beds along the railing, tomatoes climbing trellises in heavy clusters, lavender spreading into a fragrant hedge that brushed my legs when I watered in the mornings. I harvested herbs for pesto, gifted jars of homemade tomato sauce to neighbors, watched bees hover over the purple blooms without once wondering if someone was watching me watch them. Pottery had evolved into a small side passion. I sold a few pieces at local craft markets on weekends. Nothing ambitious, just enough to cover clay and glaze. Customers complimented the weight of the mugs, the way the glaze caught light like sea glass. I smiled and said, Thank you, without explaining that each piece carried the memory of hands that no longer trembled when shaping something fragile. Work had settled into a rhythm of leadership and quiet impact. As charge nurse, I mentored a rotating group of new grads, ran monthly skills labs, sat on the hospital's workplace safety committee where we pushed for better protocols around staff harassment and burnout. The support group Aisha and I started had grown into a hospital-wide initiative with paid facilitators and CE credits. I still led sessions when my schedule allowed, sharing updated versions of my story. Less raw edges now, more focus on the tools that help me rebuild: documentation, boundaries, community, patience with myself. Newer nurses arrived carrying the same invisible bruises I once hid under long sleeves. I gave them the same gentle script I'd once needed. Your instincts are not overreacting. Trust them. You're allowed to protect yourself without apology. Sophia, the woman who'd left her husband after my card exchange, came back as a guest speaker one evening. She stood in front of 20 tired nurses and said, I thought staying proved I was strong. Leaving proved I was stronger. When she finished, the room applauded. Not politely, but with the kind of relieved recognition that comes from hearing someone say the thing you're afraid to voice. After the session, she hugged me and whispered, You were the first person who didn't make me feel crazy for noticing. Those moments accumulated like compound interest, small deposits of meaning that grew into something unbreakable. Sam and I had moved in together 6 months earlier, into a 2-bedroom row house near the river with a backyard big enough for a proper garden, and a porch where we drank coffee on weekend mornings. The transition felt easy, not rushed. We talked through boundaries early, no surprise visits when one of us needed space, clear check ins about touch and mood, separate bank accounts for personal spending. because independence mattered. He cooked terrible pancakes on Sundays and laughed when I fixed them. I left sticky notes on the fridge with reminders like buy more coffee and you're allowed to rest. Affection between us stayed gentle, hands that asked before they held, kisses that lingered without demanding more, arguments that ended in apologies instead of escalation. Priya teased that we were disgustingly healthy. I took it as the highest compliment. Dating no longer felt like navigating a minefield. My social circle had widened, pottery friends who invited me to gallery openings, running buddies who planned group trail races, hospital colleagues who hosted potlucks where no one drank too much or got possessive. Maya remained my constant. We still met for Sunday coffee, now with Sam sometimes tagging along. The three of us sprawled at our favorite table, trading stories until the cafe closed. One Sunday, she looked at me across lattes and said, "You used to check the door every 5 minutes. Now you don't even glance." I hadn't noticed the change until she pointed it out. The fear that had once lived in my bones had migrated to a small, manageable corner, enough to keep me alert, not enough to rule my days. Then came the unexpected coda. A package arrived at the row house, no return address, postmarked from Ryan's coastal town. Inside was a plain wooden box, hand carved with uneven lines that suggested amateur work, and a single sheet of paper folded neatly on top. The note read, "Made this in a woodworking class. Thought you might like it for your garden or wherever. No expectations. Just wanted to say I'm still working on myself. You were right to leave. Take care. R." The box held a small bird feeder, simple cedar, roof slightly crooked but sturdy enough to last. No apology tour, no plea for contact, just an object offered without strings. I set it on the kitchen table and stared at it for a long time. Sam came home from his shift, saw it, asked quietly, "You okay?" I nodded. "Yeah, it feels closed." We didn't debate what to do with it. I carried the feeder to the backyard, hung it from a low branch of the maple we'd planted the previous spring, filled it with seed. Birds found it within days. Sparrows first, then a pair of cardinals that flashed red against the green. Watching them from the porch, I felt the last knot loosen. Ryan had finally learned something. Maybe not everything, maybe not enough to undo the damage, but enough to stop fighting the consequences. He'd expected me to crumble under pressure, to accept roughness as affection, to come back when the loneliness got heavy. Instead, he got 5 years of enforced distance, court mandated classes, lost jobs, lost charm, and a woman who turned every boundary he crossed into a step toward her own freedom. I didn't need to forgive him to be whole. I needed to keep choosing myself, day after ordinary day. That evening, Sam and I sat on the porch swing, watching the cardinals dart to the feeder. He draped an arm around my shoulders, light, casual, exactly the right amount of weight. I leaned into him and said, "I think I'm ready to stop looking over my shoulder." He kissed the top of my head. "You already did, a while ago." The sun dipped low, painting the yard gold. Birds sang. Tomatoes ripened on the vine. Lavender scented the air. Life continued. Quiet, steady, mine. The consequences Ryan never saw coming weren't fireworks or ruin. They were this: a woman who no longer accepted pain as proof of love, who built safety from the ground up, who loved and was loved without conditions or bruises. He tried to define affection on his terms. I redefined it on mine. And in the end, that was the only victory that mattered. 4 years after the contempt hearing that pinned Ryan to consequences he never believed would stick, the 5 year protection order expired without ceremony. No final court appearance, no dramatic last minute violation. Just a quiet administrative note from Carla confirming the term had run its course and the file was closed unless new cause arose. I read the email on a Tuesday morning while the coffee brewed, sunlight slanting through the kitchen window onto the counter where my pottery mug sat steaming. I stared at the screen for a long minute, waiting for relief or triumph, or even a flicker of old fear to surface. Nothing dramatic arrived. Instead, there was a soft, steady calm. The same calm I felt watering the garden, or running the river path, or falling asleep beside Sam without once checking the locks. The order had done its job. It had bought me time, enforced distance, forced accountability, until the habit of safety became second nature. When it ended, I didn't celebrate with fireworks or throw a party. I simply closed the laptop, kissed Sam goodbye as he headed to his shift, and went for my usual run. 9 miles now, because my legs could carry me farther without the invisible weight I used to drag. The coastal town where Ryan lived stayed 3 hours north. His life stayed there. I heard fragments through the occasional loose thread of mutual acquaintance. He'd stayed single, kept the warehouse job, volunteered at a local domestic violence prevention group once a month, teaching basic anger management workshops to men court ordered into the program. Whether the change was deep or surface level didn't matter to me anymore. What mattered was that his path no longer intersected mine, and I no longer needed to monitor whether it did. My days filled with the kind of ordinary richness that once felt out of reach. Sam and I had married the previous summer in a small backyard ceremony under the maple we'd planted together. 20 people, string lights, a playlist we'd argued over lovingly for weeks, vows we wrote ourselves promising gentleness, space, laughter, and the freedom to grow without fear. Priya officiated, teasing us through tears. Maya caught the bouquet with dramatic flair. Aisha danced barefoot on the grass until midnight. No one grabbed too hard. No one demanded proof of love through endurance. The photos showed me laughing with my head thrown back, Sam's arm around my waist, light and sure, our friends surrounding us like a quiet fortress. We honeymooned in a mountain cabin. No phones for the first 3 days. Just hikes, books, slow mornings, and nights where touch felt like coming home instead of claiming territory. Back in the city, life resumed its gentle momentum. The row house garden had become neighborhood famous. Tomatoes so sweet people knocked on the door asking for extras. Lavender sachets I tied with twine and left on porches as thank yous. I expanded the pottery studio in the garage, teaching weekend classes for women who wanted to make something with their hands after years of holding too much. My students arrived nervous, clay slipping off wheels, but left with lopsided bowls and straighter spines. One woman, mid-40s, with faint scars on her forearms she never explained, finished her first mug and said, I didn't think my hands could still make beautiful things. I hugged her without asking permission first. She hugged back. The support group at the hospital had spun off into a community nonprofit. I sat on the board, helped secure grants, spoke at fundraisers about how boundaries weren't walls but bridges back to yourself. Sophia, now a facilitator herself, co-led sessions with me. We traded stories of the women we'd helped leave, the ones who came back years later to say thank you with steady eyes and steady lives. My own story had become less a wound and more a map, something I shared when it helped, something I left folded away when it didn't. I no longer needed to prove I'd survived. I simply lived. Then, on the fourth anniversary of the day I walked out of our old apartment with a duffel and no plan, a final small echo arrived. An email from an unfamiliar address. Subject line blank. I opened it, standing in the kitchen, Sam beside me chopping onions for dinner. The message was short. Saw your name on a non-profit donor list. Figured you're doing good things. I'm still up here. Still working on me. No need to reply. Just wanted you to know the lesson stuck. Be well. R. No attachment. No hidden plea. No attempt to reopen doors. I read it once, handed the phone to Sam, and watched him read it too. He handed it back without a word, then pulled me into a hug. Loose, warm, exactly the right pressure. You okay? He asked. I nodded against his shoulder. Yeah, it feels like the end of a very long sentence. I didn't reply to Ryan. I archived the email, deleted the thread, and went back to chopping vegetables. That night we ate on the porch, fireflies blinking in the yard, the bird feeder he'd sent years ago still hanging from the maple branch, cardinals darting to it like old friends. After dinner we sat on the swing, my head on his chest, listening to crickets and distant traffic. I thought about the woman who once accepted roughness as affection, who flinched at sudden movements, who documented every bruise because she didn't trust her own memory. That woman was still part of me, scar tissue, not open wound. But she no longer led. The woman who led now ran without looking back, shaped clay without trembling, loved without bracing, enforced lines without apology. Ryan had expected tears, return, forgiveness on his timeline. He got none of those. He got distance that became permanent, consequences that reshaped his choices, and a life rebuilt so thoroughly there was no space left for his shadow. The real victory wasn't his learning, or his apology, or even the closed file. It was this: mornings without fear, nights without checking doors, love that lifted instead of crushed, a garden that grew because I tended it, not because someone demanded proof of my worth through pain. Seasons turned. The maple leafed out again, lavender bloomed purple, tomatoes ripened red. Friends gathered, laughter-filled rooms, hands held without gripping. I stood in the backyard one evening watching the sunset paint the sky gold, Sam beside me, our fingers loosely linked. I didn't think about Ryan. I thought about tomorrow's run, the pottery class I'd teach, the women who'd arrive nervous and leave steadier. I thought about how far I'd walked from that first split lip to this quiet porch. And in that ordinary moment, crickets singing, fireflies rising, love steady beside me, I understood the deepest truth. The consequences he never saw coming weren't punishment. They were freedom. My freedom. Unborrowed, unapologetic, entirely mine. And after everything, that was more than enough.